The dust had barely settled on her worn boots when Josie heard it, a sound that stopped her heart mid-beat. She had been running for 3 days straight, fleeing the arranged marriage that would have buried her alive in respectability and misery. The ghost town of Larkspur Hollow stretched before her like a graveyard of dreams, its empty windows staring accusingly at her cowardice. But then came that cry, piercing through the funeral silence like a prayer answered by accident. A baby's voice, calling her back from the edge of her own disappearance, the sound that would teach her that sometimes we don't choose our destiny, it chooses us. The morning sun cast long shadows across the abandoned main street of Larkspur Hollow, painting the weathered storefronts in shades of amber and regret. Josie Monroe pulled her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders, feeling the weight of 3 sleepless nights pressing against her bones like accumulated sorrow. Her feet, blistered and raw inside boots that had seen better decades, carried her forward with the mechanical persistence of someone who had forgotten how to stop. The town lay before her like a monument to failure, its silence so complete it seemed to swallow even the sound of her breathing. She had been running since dawn broke over the last ridge, running from the memory of her guardian's cold eyes and the stranger's hands that would have claimed her as property. The dust beneath her feet told stories of other travelers, other desperate souls who had passed through this place seeking something they couldn't name. Behind her, the road stretched back toward everything she had abandoned. The cramped boarding house, where she had scrubbed floors until her knuckles bled, the man twice her age who had paid her guardian like she was livestock at auction, the future that had been decided for her before she was old enough to understand what futures meant. The weight of her small bundle, containing everything she owned in the world, pressed against her hip with each step, a reminder of how little separated her from complete desolation. Her stomach cramped with hunger, but she had learned to ignore such complaints. Hunger was an old companion, more faithful than any human had ever been. The sun climbed higher, turning the air thick and oppressive, but still she walked, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering why she had no choice but to keep moving. Each footfall echoed in the empty street like a heartbeat counting down to something she couldn't yet imagine. The first sign of life came not as sight, but as smell, the heavy, sweet scent of flowers mixed with something darker, more final. Josie's steps slowed as she rounded the corner near what had once been the town's church, its white paint peeling like old skin in the desert heat. A gathering of perhaps 20 people stood in the small cemetery behind the building, their black clothes stark against the pale headstones that jutted from the earth like broken teeth. She could hear the low murmur of voices, the kind of hushed tones that accompanied sorrow too deep for ordinary conversation. Her first instinct was to circle around them, to avoid the intimacy of other people's grief, but something held her in place, perhaps the simple human need to witness that life still happened, even in places that looked abandoned by God. The mourners stood in a tight cluster around several fresh graves, their faces hidden beneath the brims of hats and the shadows of their own despair. As she drew closer, staying hidden behind the skeletal remains of a wagon, Josie could make out fragments of the service. The preacher's voice carried on the still air, speaking of souls taken too soon, of a fever that had swept through the town like divine judgment, leaving behind only empty houses and broken families. She counted at least 6 coffins, some so small they could only belong to children, and her throat tightened with a familiar ache, the pain of recognizing suffering that mirrored her own. These people understood loss, understood what it meant to have everything stripped away without warning or mercy. The women wept quietly into handkerchiefs that had seen too much use, while the men stood rigid as fence posts, their grief locked behind expressions of stone. This was a community saying goodbye not just to individuals, but to itself, to the dream of what Larkspur Hollow might have been before disease and hardship claimed it. The service seemed to stretch on forever, each prayer and hymn adding another layer to the thick atmosphere of mourning that hung over the cemetery like morning fog. Josie found herself unable to look away, drawn by the raw honesty of their sorrow and the way they held each other up against the weight of so much loss. She had never been part of anything like this, had never belonged to a community that would gather to mourn her passing or celebrate her life. The realization hit her with unexpected force. She was watching something she had never experienced and might never experience, the simple human dignity of being grieved. Her own death, when it came, would likely pass unnoticed, unmarked by ceremony or tears. The thought should have frightened her, but instead it filled her with a strange kind of peace, as if accepting her own insignificance somehow freed her from the burden of trying to matter. When the last prayer was spoken and the mourners began to disperse, moving slowly toward the town, like sleepwalkers returning to a dream they no longer believed in, Josie remained hidden behind the wagon, watching the empty graves settle into their eternal silence. The afternoon sun had shifted, casting new shadows across the cemetery, and she felt the familiar urge to move on, to put this place and its sorrows behind her like all the others. But as she prepared to step back onto the road that led nowhere in particular, something stopped her, a sound so faint she almost missed it, so unexpected it made her question her own ears. It came again, clearer this time, rising from the direction of the graves like a voice calling from another world. A baby's cry, thin and desperate, cutting through the silence like a blade through silk. Josie's feet moved before her mind could catch up, carrying her across the uneven ground toward the source of that impossible sound. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she approached the graves, each step bringing the crying closer, more real, more urgent. The mourners had all gone, leaving behind only the scattered evidence of their grief, wilted flowers, a forgotten handkerchief, the lingering scent of tears and earth. But there, beside the smallest of the fresh graves, something moved beneath a pile of black fabric that had been left behind in the exodus of sorrow. Josie dropped to her knees beside it, her hands trembling as she pulled away the cloth to reveal what lay beneath. A baby, no more than a few weeks old, red-faced and furious with the injustice of being abandoned to the mercy of strangers and circumstance. The child's cries pierced the air with the kind of desperation that demanded immediate action, that brooked no hesitation or careful consideration. The infant was wrapped in a blanket that had once been white but was now stained with the evidence of a difficult birth and harder circumstances. Josie lifted the tiny form with the careful reverence of someone handling something infinitely precious and infinitely fragile, feeling the weight of complete helplessness in her arms. The baby's cries softened slightly at the warmth of human contact, but continued with the persistent demand of someone who had learned early that survival required making noise. Around the child's neck hung a small piece of paper tied with string, and Josie's hands shook as she unfolded it to read the message scrawled in a desperate hand. "His name is Isaac. His mother died bringing him into this world. Please love him." The words hit her like physical blows, each one carrying the weight of a dying woman's final hope, a stranger's last act of faith in the goodness of humanity. Looking around the cemetery, Josie tried to piece together what had happened, how this child had come to be abandoned among the graves of Larkspur Hollow. The fever that had claimed so many must have taken the baby's mother, leaving him orphaned before he had even learned to focus his eyes on the world that had already failed him. Perhaps she had been one of the coffins lowered into the ground today, her final moments spent not in peace, but in the terror of knowing her child would face the world alone. The thought filled Josie with a rage so pure it surprised her. Rage at the unfairness of it all, at a world that could create such beauty and then abandon it to die among strangers. She had spent her own life feeling unwanted, unloved, but at least she had survived long enough to make her own choices. This child had been given no such luxury, no time to prove his worth or fight for his place in an indifferent universe. The baby's cries began to take on a different quality, less angry and more plaintive, as if he sensed that his fate hung in the balance of this moment. Josie found herself studying his face, memorizing the delicate features that spoke of innocence and possibility, the tiny hands that grasped at air as if trying to hold on to something solid in a world that had already proven itself unreliable. She had no experience with babies, no knowledge of what they needed beyond the basic understanding that they required food and warmth and someone to care whether they lived or died. But as she held Isaac against her chest, feeling his small body relax slightly at the steady rhythm of her heartbeat, something shifted inside her, a recognition that felt older than thought, deeper than reason. This child needed her, not because she was qualified or prepared, but because she was here, because she had heard his cry when everyone else had walked away. The practical part of her mind began cataloguing all the reasons why this was impossible, why she couldn't take responsibility for another life when she could barely manage her own. She had no money, no home, no prospects beyond the vague hope of finding work in some distant town where no one knew her story. A baby would slow her down, make her vulnerable, turn her from a problem into a catastrophe. But even as these thoughts formed, she found herself adjusting her hold on Isaac, positioning him more comfortably against her shoulder, whispering nonsense words that seemed to calm his crying. The weight of him felt right in her arms, like a missing piece she hadn't known she was looking for, like an answer to a question she had never learned how to ask. For the first time in her 17 years, someone needed her not for what she could do or provide, but simply for her willingness to stay, to not walk away when walking away would be easier. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the cemetery in shades of gold and shadow, Josie made a decision that felt less like choosing and more like surrendering to something larger than herself. She would not leave Isaac among the graves of Larkspur Hollow, would not add his small tragedy to the collection of sorrows that already haunted this place. Whatever came next, hunger, hardship, the thousand small cruelties that awaited those who had nothing to offer the world but their stubborn refusal to disappear, they would face it together. She gathered her meager belongings with one hand while holding the baby with the other, feeling the weight of her new responsibility settle around her shoulders like a cloak she had never expected to wear. The road ahead remained uncertain, but for the first time since she had started running, Josie Monroe was no longer running alone. The abandoned cabin sat like a broken promise against the twilight sky, its weathered boards grey as old bones. Josie pushed through the creaking door. Isaac pressed against her chest, his tiny fists clutching at the fabric of her worn dress. The interior smelled of dust and forgotten dreams, but it offered shelter from the desert wind that had begun to howl across the empty landscape. She had walked for hours since leaving Larkspur Hollow, her feet blistered and aching, but the baby's steady breathing against her neck had given her strength she didn't know she possessed. The silence inside the cabin felt different from the oppressive quiet of the ghost town. This was a silence that waited, that held space for new beginnings, rather than mourning old endings. She settled onto the rough wooden floor, her back against the wall, and carefully adjusted Isaac in her arms. His eyes were open now, dark and searching, as if he were trying to memorize her face in the fading light that filtered through the broken shutters. Josie found herself whispering to him, words that came from some deep well of tenderness she had never known existed within her. She told him about the stars that would soon appear overhead, about the coyotes that sang to the moon, about the way the desert bloomed after rain, with colors so bright they seemed impossible. Her voice, rough from thirst and exhaustion, became softer as she spoke, as if the act of comforting him was somehow healing something broken inside herself. The baby's hunger announced itself with a cry that cut through the evening air like a blade. Josie's heart clenched with panic. She had no milk to offer, no knowledge of how to care for an infant, only the fierce protective instinct that had claimed her at the funeral. She remembered seeing a well behind the cabin, and with trembling hands she fashioned a makeshift bottle from a piece of cloth and some water, praying it would be enough to sustain him through the night. As she watched him drink, his small fingers wrapped around her thumb with surprising strength, she felt the weight of her new reality settling into her bones. She was no longer just Josie Monroe, the orphan girl running from an unwanted marriage. She was someone's mother now, someone's entire world. The night brought sounds that made her clutch Isaac closer. The distant howl of wolves, the rustle of something moving through the brush outside, the whisper of wind through the gaps in the cabin walls. But with each sound that might have once terrified her, Josie felt herself growing stronger, more determined. She had spent 17 years learning to survive alone, to trust no one, to expect nothing from a world that had given her only hardship and loss. Now, with this tiny life depending on her, she discovered reserves of courage she had never imagined. The baby slept fitfully in her arms, his breathing shallow but steady, and she found herself making silent promises to him in the darkness, promises to protect him, to love him, to give him the childhood she had never had. As dawn approached, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, Josie made a decision that would change the course of both their lives. She could not continue running aimlessly across the desert with an infant. They needed supplies, shelter, and most importantly, they needed a place where Isaac could grow up safe and loved. The nearest town was Redemption Creek, 3 days' ride to the north, a place she had heard whispered about in the saloons and trading posts, a town where people went to start over, to leave their past behind and build something new. It would mean taking risks, trusting strangers, revealing herself to a world that might judge her harshly for claiming a child that wasn't hers by blood. But as Isaac stirred in her arms, his tiny hand reaching up to touch her face with the unconscious trust of the innocent, Josie knew that some risks were worth taking. The girl who had fled Larkspur Hollow in desperation was gone, replaced by a woman who had found her purpose in the most unexpected place, in the cry of an abandoned baby who had somehow chosen her to be his salvation. The wagon appeared on the horizon like a mirage, its canvas cover bleached white by the relentless sun, dust rising behind it in a golden cloud that shimmered in the heat. Josie had been walking for 2 days, Isaac strapped to her chest with strips of fabric torn from her petticoat, her lips cracked and bleeding from thirst. When she saw the approaching travelers, her first instinct was to hide, to melt into the sparse brush and wait for them to pass. But the baby's labored breathing and the way his skin felt hot against her touch made her step into the middle of the rutted trail instead. She raised her hand in a gesture that was half greeting, half plea, her heart hammering against her ribs as the wagon slowed and finally stopped before her. The woman who climbed down from the driver's seat was perhaps 40, with graying hair pulled back severely and eyes the color of winter sky. Her dress was practical and well-mended, and there was something in her bearing that spoke of strength earned through hardship rather than inherited through privilege. She approached Josie slowly, her gaze taking in the young woman's disheveled appearance, the makeshift baby carrier, the desperation that clung to them both like desert dust. When she spoke, her voice carried the soft drawl of someone who had been born to this harsh land and had learned to find gentleness within its cruelty. She introduced herself as Martha Henley, traveling with her husband Samuel to Redemption Creek, where they planned to open a general store and start fresh after losing their farm to drought and debt. Samuel Henley proved to be a man of few words, but kind eyes, his weathered hands gentle as he helped Josie into the back of the wagon among their carefully packed belongings. As the wagon resumed its journey, Martha sat beside her, offering water from a precious canteen and asking no questions about how a young woman had come to be alone in the desert with an infant. Instead, she shared stories of her own losses, the 3 babies she had buried before they could take their first steps, the farm that had been in Samuel's family for 2 generations before the rains stopped coming, the way hope could be both the cruelest and most necessary of human emotions. Her words created a cocoon of understanding around them, and for the first time since leaving Larkspur Hollow, Josie felt the tight knot of fear in her chest begin to loosen. Isaac seemed to sense the change in their circumstances, his crying becoming less frequent, his sleep deeper and more peaceful as the wagon rocked gently over the uneven ground. Martha had produced a proper bottle and some goat's milk from their supplies, and watching the baby drink with eager contentment, Josie felt tears of relief slide down her cheeks. The older woman pretended not to notice, instead pointing out landmarks along the trail. A distinctive rock formation that looked like a sleeping giant, a grove of cottonwoods that marked the halfway point to Redemption Creek, the distant mountains that promised cooler air and cleaner water. Each mile that passed beneath the wagon wheels felt like a step away from the girl she had been and toward the woman she was becoming. As evening approached and they made camp beside a small stream, Josie found herself sharing pieces of her story. Not the whole truth, for that felt too raw and dangerous to expose, but enough to explain her presence on the road with Isaac. She spoke of being widowed young, of losing her home, of traveling to Redemption Creek to start over with her baby son. The lies came easily, woven together with threads of truth about loss and hope and the fierce love she felt for the child in her arms. Martha listened without judgment, her own experiences having taught her that everyone carried secrets, and that sometimes the stories people told were less important than the courage it took to keep moving forward. That night, as they sat around the small campfire with Isaac sleeping peacefully in a nest of blankets Martha had arranged, Samuel played a harmonica with surprising skill, the melancholy notes drifting up toward the star-filled sky. The music seemed to speak of all the things that couldn't be put into words, the weight of starting over, the fragile nature of hope, the way love could bloom in the most unlikely circumstances. Josie closed her eyes and let the sound wash over her, feeling for the first time since her parents' death that she might not be entirely alone in the world. When the last note faded into the desert silence, she made another silent promise to Isaac, that she would find a way to give him not just survival, but a real home, a real family, a real chance at happiness. Redemption Creek spread before them like an answer to a prayer, its buildings rising from the valley floor with the determined optimism of a town that refused to surrender to the harsh realities of frontier life. The main street was wide and dusty, lined with false-fronted stores and businesses that proclaimed their services in bold, hand-painted signs. Miller's Mercantile, the Silver Dollar Saloon, Redemption Creek Hotel, and boarding house. People moved with purpose along the wooden sidewalks, their faces showing the weathered resilience of those who had chosen to build something lasting in an unforgiving land. As their wagon rolled down the main thoroughfare, Josie felt a flutter of something she had almost forgotten how to feel. Hope, fragile as a butterfly's wing, but real enough to make her heart race with possibility. Martha had insisted that Josie and Isaac stay with them at the boarding house until more permanent arrangements could be made. And as they climbed the front steps of the two-story building, Josie marveled at how quickly her life had changed direction. Just days ago, she had been running blindly across the desert, driven by desperation and fear. Now she stood on the threshold of a new life, holding a baby who had somehow chosen her to be his mother, surrounded by people who had shown her kindness without expecting anything in return. The boarding house proprietor, a stout woman named Mrs. Adelaide Crenshaw, welcomed them with the brisk efficiency of someone accustomed to travelers seeking fresh starts, her sharp eyes taking in Josie's youth and Isaac's obvious contentment in her arms without comment. The room Martha secured for them was small but clean, with a window that looked out over the town's bustling main street and a narrow bed that would accommodate both mother and child. As Josie settled Isaac into a makeshift crib fashioned from a wooden crate and soft blankets, she caught sight of herself in the small mirror above the washstand and barely recognized the young woman staring back at her. The frightened girl who had fled her uncle's house seemed like a stranger now. This woman had purpose written in the set of her shoulders, determination in the way she held her head, love shining from her eyes as she gazed down at the sleeping baby. The transformation felt both miraculous and terrifying, as if she had shed an old skin and emerged as someone entirely new. The next morning brought the practical realities of building a life in Redemption Creek. Josie needed work, a way to support herself and Isaac that wouldn't raise too many questions about her past or her sudden appearance with an infant. Martha introduced her to several of the town's business people, and it was Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell who offered the solution that would change everything. The doctor, one of the few women physicians on the frontier, had been looking for an assistant to help with her growing practice, someone who could tend to patients, maintain supplies, and assist with the difficult births that were common in a town where medical care was often a matter of life and death. The work would be demanding and sometimes heartbreaking, but it would provide steady income and the chance to learn skills that could serve her anywhere. Dr. Hartwell was a woman in her 50s, with silver-streaked hair and hands that spoke of years spent healing others, and she seemed to understand instinctively that Josie carried secrets she wasn't ready to share. During their interview in the doctor's small office behind the Main Street clinic, she asked no probing questions about Josie's past, focusing instead on her willingness to learn and her obvious devotion to Isaac. When the baby began to fuss during their conversation, Dr. Hartwell watched with professional interest as Josie soothed him with gentle words and practiced movements, then nodded with satisfaction. She had seen enough young mothers to recognize genuine maternal instinct when she encountered it, and whatever circumstances had brought this girl to Redemption Creek, it was clear that she and the baby belonged together. As the sun set on their first full day in town, Josie stood at her window holding Isaac, watching the lamplights begin to flicker on in windows up and down the street. The baby was growing stronger each day, his eyes more alert, his grip more certain when he wrapped his tiny fingers around hers. She whispered to him about the life they would build here, about the work she would do to keep them safe and fed, about the way this town seemed to offer second chances to those brave enough to reach for them. The girl, who had once believed she was destined for nothing but hardship and loss, was learning to imagine a different future, one where love could triumph over circumstance, where family could be chosen rather than inherited, where even the most unlikely dreams could take root and flourish in the fertile soil of hope. The sound of Isaac's contented sigh as he drifted off to sleep was the sweetest music Josie had ever heard. A lullaby that spoke of trust and belonging, and the infinite possibility that tomorrow might bring something beautiful.